All the way from Bokota village in Limpopo, South Africa, we bring you Missionary Minds, where you can learn about family, church history, biblical worldview issues, and of course, missions, all from the mind of a real-world missionary of almost 20 years. And Buddy Seth, last time we had just spoken about the experience and laid out all the details, tried to get the facts and understand exactly what went on. And what was particularly outstanding to me, or rather remarkable for me, is just how I can draw parallels for what the Apostle Paul went through for the gospel's sake, obviously not at the same level, but what the Apostle Paul went through for the sake of the people he was trying to reach, and still going out and trying to reach those people, and what you and your family have gone through in trying to come back. And in this episode, which is part 2, if you want to catch part 1, please go and listen to last week's episode. In this episode, which is part 2, I want to go through some of the principles we can draw from that experience. So firstly, is there one incredible lesson or insight that you would have drawn from that experience over the years?
Let me tell you what happened in the words of C.S. Lewis at the title of one of his chapters, I think in the last battle of the Chronicles of Narnia. And what happened? Oh no, it's a Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The fight and what happened after. Actually, we went back to the U.S., and when we did, we left Alpheus and Shoni Nyalungu in charge of Elam because he had been baptized. He had been baptized not long before, he and his wife, and we just up and left them. So when we left, they moved in and took over and did a great job. But previously, when I had spoken to him, he said, no, I'm not ready. But then he was forced to do it, and he willingly and graciously said, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And who is sufficient for these things? But the Lord helped him, and he did it, and he was willing. And so when we came back, we actually went to the U.S. and we applied for our visas, which we knew were about to run out. And we applied for our visas in in America, when we went back for the 8 weeks. And in the consulate in America, they said, no, you need to apply from South Africa. This is one of many things we've been told that was inaccurate by officials working for the Home Affairs Department. But they actually would not take our applications in the Chicago consulate and told us we had to come back to South Africa to apply. So we returned to South Africa, and they gave us our 90-day visitor visa, in which time we went to Home Affairs to reapply for our 3-year visitor's visa in South Africa. At which point they said the law changed as of October 2014. That is 3 months earlier, the law changed, and now we cannot apply for our visa from within the country, from in South Africa. We have to go back to America, which I said, no, you don't understand. We were just in America. We just took this application to America, the consulate, and they told us to come here. No, they now say in South Africa, go back to America. So if you're following this, because of the crime in South Africa, a family of 6 traveled back to America in the face of tragedy. While in recovering, we went to the consulate in America, the South African consulate in America, and applied for our visas. They said, no, we won't take your application. You must go back to South Africa. When we went back to South Africa, they said, no, you cannot do this. The law changed in October 4 months ago. When I say, well, why didn't your people tell us that? They said, apparently they didn't have the memo. We said, that's not our fault. That's your fault. Well, you have to go back to America. So that's thousands and thousands of dollars. We were forced to go back to America a second time within 90 days. So we have to make another cross-Atlantic trip, and we have to leave that little church in the hands of Alpheus and Shoni again. And Alpheus, again, was concerned and felt a lot of weight as he was working full-time and his wife was working full-time. But they, again, with the power of the Spirit of God, took over and stepped up and took over the work of the church when we went back to America. I think we went back in May, June, July, again in 2015. So about 16 or 17 weeks, about 4 or 5 months, we were gone. And they just did the job, and they did a great job. We went back to America the second time, and it was very heavy because it's very expensive to travel. And the Lord was very kind to us. We were able this time to lodge our applications. The memo at that time had reached the Chicago consulate, and they allowed us to reapply. They gave us our 3-year visitor's visas, and we returned to South Africa. In the midst of all this, if you can follow this, if it's not too complex, being thrown back and forth across the seas and the visas and being pushed here and there, the church, the Elim church that we had planted, is now being forced to stand on its own 2 feet because we're not there. And then when we arrived back in South Africa, Johanna was one of my wife's dear friends who lived about 5 houses north of our house in Makongele. In Makongele, the night of the attack, we called on Skype from our computer. They didn't steal our desktop. They stole our phone and our laptop and left the desktop. We called on Skype to the police and to our neighbors and to Paul and Melinda Schleyline. And that woman actually, Johanna Manansako, came up to us that night. She had been at the ZCC church all of her life. And Amy had done Bible studies with her back in
For our American listeners, what is the ZCC? Very short.
Sorry, ZCC stands for Zion Christian Church. In South Africa and British Dominions, they say Z for Z, ZCC, ZCC, Zion Christian Church. And it is, among, as all the churches are, a cult or a false church that does not preach the gospel. This church, which is no church, but calls itself a church, blends syncretism. It blends African fear of spirits with Christian terminology like Bible and Jesus and God. She had been going to that church when my wife met her in 2008, and they met in this way. She came to our house asking for work. And she said, if I don't get work, I'm going to kill myself because my life is very hard. And she proceeded to tell how very difficult her life was. And Amy said, well, I don't need someone to work, but I don't want you to kill yourself. Why don't you come here 2 days a week and you can clean here in our house? So Johanna came twice per week. And during that time, Amy would do Bible studies with her, and they became friends. And then after about 6 or 8 months, the contract ended. Oh, she got a job. Johanna got a job. And so she didn't work at our house anymore. Then when Johanna became pregnant with her second son, Emmanuel, the Tsonga idiom is ubihile, you ugly, when you're pregnant. So to speak of a woman who's pregnant, the normal idiomatic way is to say, you are ugly. That, of course, raises an ethical question. Should a Christian use the Tsonga idiom if it speaks to a woman in a disrespectful term about something as wonderful as having a baby? So when a woman is ugly in the ZCC religious gatherings, you're not allowed to attend their religious gatherings. It's shayila, or it's taboo. It's one of the things we don't do. You don't come to the religious gathering if you are ugly. So pregnant women are not allowed to attend during the entire time of their confinement to attend those religious gatherings, which is, of course, in total contrast to Christianity, which says we love life, we love family, we love the weaker vessels, and we support and encourage them and help them, not throw them to the side. So when Johanna was, quote, ugly, close quote, she came to our church. That is our little church plant where I was teaching verse by verse at that time through the book of Hebrews. She was there for 9 months. And during that time, she heard almost the entire book of Hebrews taught verse by verse from me. And that did not affect her. So that when she was delivered of her child, she returned to the safety of the sharks. She jumped out of the lifeboat back into the ocean. And it was very sad to us and overwhelmed us, thinking, who can be saved? She didn't hear 1 or 2 or 3 sermons. She heard 9 months of sermons. How can we expect anyone to be converted? And that was years ago, I think back in 2010, 2011. But then in 2014, she came to us the night of the attack. She came with a slasher, a little metal stick for cutting down weeds. And she really loved us and loved my wife. And she asked Amy, are you ever going to come back when we said we were leaving? And Amy said, we don't know. And Johanna was really shaken by that. When we came back from America to stay in Africa, she showed up at our church, the Elim Baptist Church. She showed up there. And I asked her after the service, we're so glad to see you. Why are you here? We know you have your religious gathering. And Johanna said, I want to be baptized. To which I replied, well, we can talk about that, but you have to be born again before you can be baptized. To which she said, okay, I'll do that. What do I have to do? Well, before you can be born again, you have to study the Bible and understand. Oh, I'll do that, she said. I'm ready. So that led us into a discussion right there that Sunday after church, me and her. I'm kind of taken back. Johanna, what are you talking about? You for years we've known you. You've done Bible studies with my wife. You prayed a sinner's prayer years and years ago, and then came to hear 9 months of preaching verse by verse through the book of Hebrews, and then you went back to the evil, wicked, false teachers. And what changed now? And here was her story. Again, this is all recorded on my wife's blog. She said, when you left after the crime, I went to the people in the village and said, we didn't support them. We didn't help them. We didn't encourage them. And look at this. God was so kind. He sent these people here to help us, and you didn't listen to them. And then after a while, I realized I didn't listen to them either. I'm setting myself up as if I did good, but I didn't come to their church. I didn't listen to them. I didn't really take in their message. And again, as best we can remember the details, we tried to write them down immediately after it happened. She said something very much like to me in Chitsonga. I began to be very afraid that God had taken away my light. And I prayed that God would send you back to our village. And I said that if this is really the true religion, I would know it, because God would, if a white woman could come back to the place where they had beaten her and tried to kill her children, that has to be the true God. And from 2015 until 2023, she has been one of the most faithful members at the Elim Baptist Church, and we're not attending there anymore. She still perseveres with both of her sons. And I look at that and I'm so encouraged that what verse by verse teaching through Hebrews did not do, although of course God loves to save men through the foolishness of preaching, it was Christian love and perseverance and returning to the path of duty that God used. And there's probably other good things that God has done that we don't know. But God used that crime to force us out of that place. And that really was the beginning of Elim becoming self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-governing, because it forced Alpheus to take over the leadership as pastor. And it brought at least Johanna and her sons into the membership of the church.
And as I think about that, brother, there are a couple of things I want to draw out. Firstly, I think once again of the life of the Apostle Paul and how in the Lord's providence he used the persecution and trials that he went through to further the gospel and for the establishing of churches. And I also think of how Scripture teaches us that people will ask for the reason of the hope that exists within us.
Yeah.
And Joanna saw that there was something of a hope that existed in your families, and which is all of Christ's doing, of course. She saw that there was something there that would bring you back, and that caused her, that spurred her onwards in the Lord drawing her to true faith.
And it's wonderful that it was uniquely Amy, because I'm preaching on the streets, I'm evangelizing, I'm outgoing, but there's a unique kind of message that goes across when a woman just loves the Lord and does what's right. And maybe the idea sometimes is that they're overlooked, or wives are overlooked, or they're not powerful. But we all know that's not true. And that's just one good practical example that women are more powerful than they may be given credit for.
Yes, thanks for that, brother. And the way the Lord has used women in Scripture as well. You think of Lydia and Phoebe and many others who the Lord has used. And so it's wonderful to even see that worked out even in our day and age.
Can I give a verse? The verse that was constantly on my mind during that time and was very difficult for my wife. I don't think this verse helped my wife. And I shared it with her. And then maybe I was foolish for sharing this verse with her, because some others did share verses with my wife, and they were very hard and heavy, and they didn't help her. Or at least, according to as best as we can discern, they didn't help. But other verses did help. But 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And when Paul says our light affliction, you mentioned earlier, following in the footsteps of Paul, his sufferings, which this is nothing like his sufferings, because that's from 2 Corinthians 4, where he actually lists many of his sufferings. Then at the end of listing them, he says, oh, that's all light. Being shipwrecked, being beaten, being stoned, being kicked out, all these difficulties, those are light. Those are small things. Yeah, that's right. And that did help me. And because especially if you take out the chapter division from chapter 4 to chapter 5, it says repeatedly, we earnestly groan. What do we groan for? That we could take off this tabernacle and put on the real house. Well, what does that mean? It means get rid of this body and get the real body. As best I understand Paul, that means die. Paul is eagerly groaning to die. That's a theology that needs to be promoted more and needs to be taught more. We're not trying to kill ourselves, but we are not afraid of death. We're ready for it, and there's not a bad thing to die if we die in the Lord.
One other thing I'd like to draw from the experience there is you're speaking about the establishment of the church in Elam, and Pastor Alpheus in that section, you spoke about the difficulty of the visa trials going back and forth. And it's interesting that what we read about in books and what people hear about when they think about the adventures of the mission field are the trials, like what we discussed in the last episode, which are the bullets and the beatings, and all those are very sad to think of. But there are many other trials that are endured as well in being a missionary, spending hours and thousands of dollars going forth between countries and sitting in home affairs offices and all. And it's a very unglamorous aspect of missions.
In the top 5 most difficult things that our family has gone through, and I can guess by extrapolation to other families from what I've heard from them, in the top 5 would definitely be apathy, language, and visas, governmental difficulties. The apathy of people who are not heavily influenced by the Bible, the visa and governmental papers and difficulties, and the language. Absolutely, those would go in the top 5.
Could you share with us, how do you encourage a fellow believer who may be thinking about missions but is deterred by the cost when they hear of stories like these, whether it's the pain of that traumatic trial or whether it's some of the uphill battles with visas and the like? And how does the Lord's providence work through all of that?
That's a good question too. What if someone's listening and they say, can I do that? Can I? Well, first of all, no one can be a martyr in advance because God gives grace as is needed. Doesn't he say in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread? And the Catechism tells us that means pray that God will give us the things needful to our bodies and our souls. No one has the grace to be burnt at the stake who's not being asked to be burnt at the stake. It's very good for you to ask yourself, do I have that grace? Oh, God, give me that. Oh, I don't think I have that kind of faith. That's the right way to think, and that's the right way to pray. But the reality is, no, you don't have that faith, and I don't have that faith because he gives measured. He pours out the measure of grace according to each one's need. So if you have a need to do something for his glory, then step on it. Go, move. He will give the grace to do that thing. Esther had the need to simply walk out of the woman's house, walk across the green lawn, across probably the fountains with the sun shining in her beautiful robes. Maybe, as we could imagine, take a left-hand turn, breathe deep, step up the steps, and then into the doorway of the inner court of the king's room where he does his official business. She needed that grace, and she had that grace. She didn't need the grace to punch Haman in the nose. She needed the grace to do that walking, and that was pretty stressful for her. But she, after 3 days of prayer, did it. And any man or woman needs to have that grace. My wife, I really wish she were here to give her side because she'd say it very well and put it in woman's kind of terms. My wife is wonderful and I love to praise her, but my wife in this regard is very normal. She's just a normal woman who loves the Lord, who if she were asked back when she was 21, do you have the strength to, and then list all the things she's endured? No, she would say, because she's very honest about that. One of her virtues is to not overplay things. She will not overplay her gifts or her weaknesses to the best of her knowledge or the gifts or weaknesses of anyone else. And she'd say, no, I don't think I have that strength. And she's probably telling the truth. She doesn't have that strength or this strength to go through this or that difficulty. And our Lord knows that. But he also knows, oh, but what you don't know is I'm going to put things far worse in your life than you ever knew you could deal with. But when you have to deal with them, I'm going to pour out exactly enough from the cup that you need to get through those things. That's what I would say to a young person. Go, take the next step like Esther, and you'll find you have the strength to do that, just that step, but no more.
Thanks for that. Could you also comment for us, how do you disciple your family through such a trial? What was that experience like as the head of the home?
Yeah, again, I would rather have my wife be here because I love my kids and my wife, and I did my best, but I probably messed up a lot of things. Maybe I tried to listen to them. I tried to pray with them. I tried to keep on being Christians. We didn't stop going to church. We went to church the next Sunday after. That was on Tuesday. We went to church the next Lord's Day, and every Lord's Day after that. We kept reading and praying. We started reading Pilgrim's Progress together at that time. I tried to look for the things that she wanted, to try to give her things that she wants. But I'm sure I was too harsh or too soft or too impatient, or I'm sure I didn't listen as I should. And maybe sometimes I was too, a godly man once said, it's not hard to raise kids. Just basically do what's right. I tried to do what's right. So in general, I probably did what's right because I just loved her. And if she would cry, I'd stop talking and just listen. And there was a lot of crying. And maybe that was, expect when hard things happen, expect when there's stress, that it shows up at times that you totally don't expect it, and in ways maybe you can't draw a straight line. So if we're having later on financial difficulties, which we did have because of plane flights and visas, expect that the stress of the crime is going to show up and make the stress of the finances even worse. So maybe be prepared for that. I don't have very good advice except be a good Christian all the time. And just be willing to listen, and don't think of yourself as a very good guy because you did 2 or 3 things to try to help them. And be really, really patient, because maybe you'll heal or recover more quickly than she will. And maybe you'll think you're healed, and maybe you're not healed. Be very doubtful of yourself and very patient with your wife. And I wish she were here. She'd probably say okay to that.
Thank you, brother. And I think the advice is actually more helpful than you think, because as you're speaking, I can see you trying to discern and trying to pick apart all the little elements. And I think there's something to that. There's no copy and paste formula that'll just work like, hey, if I tell you these magic tools, you'll disciple your family perfectly. And I think the way you're speaking about it reflects the difference between you and her, how quickly you recovered, and also reflects when we're instructed, live with your wife in an understanding way. And so you have to gain an understanding and navigate and handle this carefully.
And I'm so different. I'm so different from my wife. And like you just said, live with your wife in an understanding way. Know her specifically and know yourself specifically. I could see another man with different gifts and different strengths, maybe erring in another way, and so not coming back. But maybe my error was to be less caring, less patient, too harsh, or too driven, maybe. Wow, who's sufficient for these things? As Jeremiah 17 says, who can know the heart? I can't even know my own heart. I can't know my wife's heart. You can know little bits, but not the whole thing. Very tricky. Just pray for grace. However gracious you are with your wife and kids, be more gracious. And however driven you are, be more driven. And pray.
Could you tell us, how does one discern whether to stay or whether to go? Because in one sense, you left where you stayed, where you used to stay. But in another sense, you've stayed in South Africa, trying to serve the same mission field.
Well, my response to that would be, in general, I think we're all very weak. We're all very soft on ourselves. In general, especially in the 21st century, we look for safety. We don't want to risk like Paul. So in general, as a default, men, you need to push your wives to risk. Because in general, we don't risk enough. We're too soft. We're too weak. We're too flabby. We're too whatever. Let's just be honest about that. That's what happens in the 21st century when people are fat everywhere. Even poor people are fat because there's just more today. So that's just a potential weakness of the 21st century. So recognize that. And so in my mind, I was always thinking, we're going to go back, of course. But then I have to, okay, let's be open. I want to make sure that I'm loving my wife. I don't want to end up with a scenario where my wife goes crazy, like with the heroes on my wall behind you, Carney, William Carey. I don't want my wife to go crazy. I don't want to abuse her. I want to get to the end with her happily taking my hand and not just me always reaching out for her hand. I want her to gladly every day be reaching out. Can I hold your hand, Seth? And that's only going to come if there's gentle love and grace. But at the same time, she's capable of much more than she realizes. She's doing now much more than she ever thought that she could. And so there's a balance in that too. But in general, push for more. Don't give up the unreached people groups, because even Christ did not please himself, Romans 15:3. Don't give up until the end.
And as we close off here, could you give us some inspirations from church history that you drew from during the trial?
Church history tells me that we're all wimps. This is one difficult time. We've gone through a number of difficult times, whatever, but this is one difficult time. And then when you read Adoniram Judson, the prolonged and extended, overwhelming difficulties that he and Carey went through are so great. Bunyan, 14 years in prison. Spurgeon, over and over and over. So all who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Keep reading church history and you'll feel like whatever difficulties you're going through, are very slight. John Owen loses 6 kids before they're adults. And that's a guy who doesn't even leave his home country. Yeah. We have it much easier than most in the 21st century.
What a treat, Mfundisi. To our audience, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to rate it and subscribe to keep posted with more upcoming content. Feel free to share this episode with someone who might find it interesting, and submit any questions you may want answered in a future podcast. You can email those questions to paulslayline@gmail.com. You can also visit betweentwocultures.com for other resources like this. I'm your host, Yamikani Katunga, and until next time, that's it from Missionary Minds.